Let's take a look at how our formative assessment feedback can empower students, families, and teachers. In this mini lesson, we will review characteristics of formative feedback, discuss shifting energy towards student ownership of feedback, as well as improving feedback communication with families. You will also notice HE, SR, and MT at the bottom of certain slides. These abbreviations indicate content that directly connects to JEFCO's learning targets, high expectations, student relationships, and maximizing time. When we consider effective feedback characteristics, feeding up, feeding back, and feeding forward, we put them all together to form a loop for learners. That includes the why, what, and how for learning. The stakeholders who have this information have better clarity about the entirety of the learning process, as well as a heightened ability to become empowered as learning is occurring. Additionally, we must consider what type of information we are sharing in the feedback. Task-related feedback addresses immediate performance in and of itself. It does not promote transfer of learning. Process-oriented feedback provides information about how learning connects to a broader context and helps to connect the dots for the learner between short-term tasks and long-term learning goals. Tasks and process feedback serve an important role in guiding the student towards learning goals. Feeding up clearly describes for the learner, where am I going? How will I know that I've arrived? And how will I show that I've arrived? Feeding up is important for learners to internalize immediate learning targets and contextualize long-term learning goals. A common understanding of the learning targets is the first step to finding success in effective feeding up efforts. A common method many educators use for feeding up in the classroom might be similar to "Today we are learning," or "The key questions for the learning today are." Consider the power of the partnership. How might you shift your current practice to increase student ownership in this work of feeding up? An example of engaging students in feeding up as owners of their learning would be to provide class time for students to set, revisit, and revise goals for learning targets that have been collectively revised into student friendly language. For families, we can communicate the purpose of the learning alongside well defined success criteria by providing structures that support students in sharing this information directly with families. We shift the cognitive load from the teacher to the student when we put the student in charge of this task. Sharing with families could be as straightforward as an email from the student to the family, copying the teacher, describing the purpose and the learning goals of the lesson or unit. While these communication skills are being developed, it may be helpful to provide a form letter for the students to individualize the email. This method can serve a purpose for face to face, hybrid, and fully remote learning models. Feeding back. Where am I now? Feeding back is critical in helping learners understand their current performance. It informs successes and needs and should cause thinking. John Hattie, a well known education researcher, found that the overwhelming amount of information students receive from teachers about their learning is associated with feeding back. Some traditional strategies educators use for feeding back might sound like, "You have not met the learning target yet because," or "Your answer is or isn't what we are looking for because." Another trend Hattie and others found when analyzing feedback: educators often miss an opportunity to shift the cognitive load to students when feeding back because they don't give the student sufficient time to think and reflect. Instead of providing information of exactly what is working and what needs to improve, feeding back can be reshaped for students so they have to investigate their performance to determine some of the information for themselves. We come back to the power of the partnership. When considering how to increase student ownership, how can educators help students share feeding back information with their families? Whether face to face instruction or remote learning, here are some additional practices for families that could push the cognitive load to students. Encouraging academic conversations to continue at home is one powerful way to reinforce learning from class. Sentence stems or dialogue prompts provided to families specific to the current learning target can be incredibly helpful. Sharing grade level examples that reflect current learning targets can also be informative for families in the learning process. Perhaps an electronic anonymous student work bulletin board could serve this purpose. Feeding forward. How am I going to get there? Feeding forward guides next steps in the learning process. It focuses on taking purposeful action based on current performance. This information provides clarity for the learner around the next steps in learning, as well as suggestions for improving performance. Common feeding forward information an educator could share with students might sound like: to fully meet the learning target, you could, or adding, removing blank could improve your work. The value of feeding forward grows exponentially when students and families can make direct connections to feeding up as well as feeding back, closing that loop of feedback. Action steps for learning become much more relevant when the learner understands the ultimate learning goal, current performance level, and how to overcome the gap in between. Think about working on a puzzle. Your understanding of the end goal, as well as the best strategies to use to reach that goal, become much more informed and effective when you can see what the completed puzzle should look like, as well as the pieces you'll use to form the puzzle. So, how does this information support my practice? As we continue to put the pieces together in our practice, let's consider how we are supporting high expectations, building and valuing relationships in the process, and utilizing digital tools to serve all stakeholders. We can ask ourselves, what has been working well in my formative assessment feedback? And how can I sustainably improve my formative assessment feedback to increase student ownership and engage families, whether in face to face, hybrid, or remote learning models?